The message reached Wehrmacht headquarters just after sunrise. It was only 3 words, printed on a strip of teletype paper. They won't stop. The officer who read it knew exactly what it meant. Not the Americans with their endless Sherman tanks, not the British with their slow and careful advances. It meant the Canadians, the men who had crossed an ocean and turned normal defensive fighting into something that felt like a force of nature. The winter of 1944 was supposed to bring relief. German planners looked out over the frozen land of northwest Europe and made the same calculations they always did. Winter meant mud. Mud meant everything would slow down. Slow fighting meant time to regroup, build defenses, and prepare. On paper, the numbers said big attacks would stop. Both sides would dig in and wait for better weather. Someone forgot to tell the Canadians. Lieutenant Klaus Richter had been fighting since Poland. He was 40 years old, though the war had aged him beyond that. Grey had started to creep into his dark hair at the temples, lines cut deep around his eyes, the kind of lines that come from squinting through smoke and dust, from watching horizons for movement, from seeing things no man should have to see. He had watched the Blitzkrieg tear through France in 1940. He had seen entire armies disappear on the Eastern Front, swallowed by snow and distance and the grinding machinery of total war. He had survived the long, brutal fighting in Italy, where every hill was a fortress and every valley ran red. He thought of himself as a practical man, a realist. To him, war was about weapons, numbers and positions, mathematics written in steel and blood. If you had more guns, more men, better terrain, you won. If you didn't, you died. Simple as that. There was no room for sentiment in his calculations, no space for emotion or fear or hope, just cold analysis, just the numbers. It had kept him alive when so many others had fallen. When his unit was ordered to hold a strong defensive line outside a small town in Belgium, he felt calm. The bunkers were solid, reinforced concrete, 2 feet thick, positioned to cover every approach. The fields in front of them were wide and clear, offering no cover to advancing infantry. The roads leading in were mined, each explosive carefully placed and recorded on his maps, and the weather was getting worse by the hour. Richter stood in the entrance of his command bunker, watching the rain fall. It had been raining for 3 days without stopping. The ground had turned into thick mud that swallowed boots and gear. The temperature was falling, degree by degree. Thin ice was forming around the edges of puddles. Supply trucks were getting stuck halfway up the roads, their wheels spinning uselessly in the mire. It was weather that made simply staying alive uncomfortable. Fighting in it felt impossible. His commander, a tired colonel who had fought in the last war, stood beside him. "They'll wait," the colonel said, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook slightly. "No one attacks in this." Richter wanted to believe him. Every military doctrine said the same thing. Winter operations in conditions like these were prohibitive. Visibility was poor, movement was treacherous, coordinating units across broken ground in darkness and rain was nearly impossible. Any sane army would wait for better conditions. But there was something nagging at the back of Richter's mind, a whisper of doubt that he couldn't quite silence. He had heard stories. Everyone on the Western Front had heard stories. On the 4th night, while Richter was checking the front line positions, he heard something that made his stomach drop. Not tanks, not artillery. Singing. At first it was faint, carried by the wind and rain, distorted by distance. But there was no doubt about it. Rough voices in English, out of tune, coming from somewhere beyond their wire. They weren't singing national anthems or marching songs. These were barrack songs, crude and vulgar, the kind of songs soldiers sang when they were drunk or bored or trying to keep their spirits up in miserable conditions. One of his sentries, a young boy from Bavaria named Dieter Vogel, stared at him with wide eyes. The boy was 19 years old. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the kind of face that belonged on recruiting posters. He still had that look of innocence that hadn't been completely beaten out of him yet. He'd only been at the front for 6 weeks. "Sir," Vogel said, his voice uncertain. "Are they drunk?" Richter did not answer immediately. He stood in the rain, listening to those distant voices, and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, exactly, not yet, but something close to it. He had heard the stories. Everyone on the Western Front had. The Canadians sang before they attacked, not as psychological warfare in any official sense. It wasn't planned or coordinated. It was personal, men letting you know they were there, daring you to stop them. "Stand to," Richter said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain. "Pass it on, they're coming." Vogel's face went pale. He opened his mouth as if to ask another question, then closed it. He nodded once and disappeared into the darkness to alert the other positions. Richter pulled his collar tighter against the cold and stared out into the night. The singing grew louder. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was even worse. Richter stared into the darkness as rain hit his face. The air had turned colder. He could see his breath now, white mist in the black night. No army was supposed to attack in weather like this. You could barely see 10 meters in front of your face. The ground was deadly, mud mixed with ice, treacherous with every step. Moving units in any kind of order would be nearly impossible. The first blast hit their left flank, then another. Then a line of explosions rolled forward toward their position with frightening accuracy. Richter threw himself into the trench, landing hard in ankle-deep water. Fire and mud filled the air above him. The concussive force of the shells slammed against his chest, made his ears ring, rattled his teeth. The Canadians were known for their artillery. They had learned it from their fathers in the last war, men who had mastered the creeping barrage at WWII Ridge in 1917. They could drop shells so close to their own soldiers that fragments fell on both sides at the same time. But when the shelling lifted, there was no break, no pause to recover, no time to get the machine guns ready, no moment before the attack. The attack was already there. Dark shapes came out of the smoke and rain like ghosts. They were not running, they were walking forward through the explosions, slow and steady, calm and unhurried. Somehow, more frightening than a wild charge would have been. There was something unnatural about it, something that violated every instinct Richter had developed over 5 years of war. Men were supposed to run when shells were falling. They were supposed to seek cover, to throw themselves flat, to do anything except walk calmly forward as if they were on a Sunday stroll. But the Canadians kept coming. Richter grabbed his rifle and shouted orders, but his voice vanished in the noise, the crash of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, the screams of wounded men, all of it merged into a wall of sound that swallowed everything else. His machine gun position opened fire. Tracer rounds cut through the rain, bright lines of light in the darkness. He saw at least 3 Canadians fall, their shapes crumpling to the ground. The others did not drop for cover. They did not pull back. They shifted their line and kept moving forward. One of them was carrying something strange. It looked like a bundle of pipes and wires, several objects tied together with tape and cord, wrapped around a group of thick, round cylinders. Richter couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. It wasn't a flamethrower. It wasn't a standard explosive charge. Before he could understand what it was, his position exploded. The blast threw him backward. He hit the back wall of the trench hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. His helmet flew off. His rifle was torn from his hands. For a moment there was nothing but white light and pressure and pain. When the ringing in his ears faded enough to hear again, he realized the machine gun post was gone, not damaged, gone. Where men and steel had been only seconds earlier, there was now only a crater. Steam rose from the torn earth, mixing with the rain and smoke. Through the haze, the Canadians were still coming. dark figures moving forward with mechanical precision, stepping over bodies, bypassing destroyed positions, pressing deeper into the defensive line. Richter scrambled to his feet, gasping for breath. His hands were shaking. Blood ran down the side of his face from a cut on his scalp, mixing with rain and mud. "Fall back!" he shouted. Fall back to secondary positions." His voice was hoarse, barely audible even to himself. But the order was already being executed. His men were withdrawing, moving back through communication trenches to prepared fallback positions. They were not destroyed. They were not running in panic. They were conducting a fighting withdrawal exactly as they had been trained to do. But they were withdrawing because holding that line was no longer possible. As they moved back through the rain, Richter could not forget the sight of those men walking forward through the shell fire, or the terrible weapon they had somehow built and used in conditions where most armies would have cancelled the whole attack. The next morning, Richter sat in a dugout headquarters 3 kilometers behind the line, writing his after-action report. His hands were still shaking. He had washed the blood from his face, but his uniform was still caked with mud. His ears still rang from the explosions. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those dark shapes walking through the rain. He picked up his pen and began to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster. Enemy forces launched assault during period of heavy precipitation and reduced visibility. Conditions previously deemed prohibitive for offensive operations. Attack commenced approximately 0200 hours with concentrated artillery barrage demonstrating exceptional accuracy despite weather conditions. He paused, staring at what he had written. The words were professional, clinical, the kind of language expected in military reports. But they didn't capture what he had experienced. They didn't convey the feeling of watching men walk calmly through an artillery barrage. They didn't express the shock of seeing his strongest defensive position simply disappear. He added another line. Unknown explosive device of exceptional destructive power employed against fortified positions. Standard bunker construction proved inadequate. Still not enough. His hand moved almost without conscious thought. This enemy is different. He stared at those words for a long moment, then crossed them out. Too subjective, too emotional, not appropriate for an official report. But he couldn't shake the thought. 5 years of war had taught him to read patterns, to understand tactics, to predict enemy behavior based on doctrine and training and national character. The Americans fought with overwhelming material superiority. Endless tanks, endless supplies, endless air support. You could predict them because they didn't need to be clever. They could simply grind you down with resources. The British fought with discipline and coordination. Methodical, careful, never taking unnecessary risks. You could predict them because they followed their doctrine religiously. But the Canadians fought like the rules didn't apply to them. The intelligence briefing was held at 900 hours. Richter sat in a room with a dozen other officers, all of them looking as tired and shell-shocked as he felt. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and damp wool. A major from the intelligence section stood at the front of the room, pointing to a map covered in red markings. "What you experienced last night was not an isolated incident," the major said. His voice was dry, academic, as if he were lecturing at a university rather than describing battlefield defeats. Canadian forces have demonstrated a pattern of behavior that deviates significantly from Allied norms. He gestured to captured documents spread across a table. "We have intelligence reports, interrogation transcripts, and physical evidence recovered from multiple engagements. What Lieutenant Richter encountered appears to be what they call a cluster charge." The major picked up a photograph. It showed the twisted remains of what had once been a bunker. Where concrete walls had stood, there was now only rubble and a smoking crater. "Multiple high explosive charges," the major continued, "bound together with wire, rope, electrical tape, or whatever materials are available. The charges are wired to create a single devastating weapon, the combined explosive force of multiple detonations in one catastrophic blast. He paused, letting that sink in. These devices violate every safety protocol in existence. They are unstable, dangerous to transport, sensitive to shock. They could easily kill the person carrying them. Another pause. The Canadians use them anyway. Richter leaned forward, studying the photograph more closely. "Where do they get them?" someone asked. "Are they being supplied through official channels?" "No," the major said. "They are improvised, built in the field from whatever explosives the soldiers can acquire. Standard satchel charges combined with captured German grenades, British plastic explosives bundled with Canadian TNT, sometimes even unexploded ordnance recovered from bombardment sites." He pulled out another document. "This practice appears to have originated in Italy. A Sergeant Thomas Morrison of the Royal Canadian Regiment was reportedly among the first to experiment with combining charges in this manner. He was frustrated by the thickness of German bunker walls. Standard weapons would damage them, but rarely destroy them outright," the major read from the document. "During a lull in fighting, Morrison took 3 captured German stick grenades, bound them together with electrical tape scavenged from a destroyed vehicle, and attached them to a standard British satchel charge using wire. The result, when detonated against a test position, was described as spectacular. The combined blast didn't just damage the fortification, it obliterated it. The pressure wave was strong enough to kill anyone inside, even if the structure didn't completely collapse." Richter felt his stomach turn. Morrison shared his innovation with his platoon. They shared it with their company. Within weeks, Canadian units across the front were assembling their own variations. Each unit developed slightly different techniques, modifications based on what materials are available and what specific obstacles they face. The major pulled out one more document. This one looked official, stamped with unit designations and classification markings. "This is from the 346th Infantry Division, captured 2 weeks ago," he read aloud. "The Canadian soldier does not wait for specialized equipment or engineer support. He builds what he needs from what he has. This improvisation extends to their explosive devices, which vary wildly in composition and power, making defensive preparations extremely difficult. Standard bunker construction may be inadequate against these weapons." The room fell silent. Richter looked around at the other officers. He saw the same expression on their faces that he knew must be on his own: uncertainty, doubt, the beginning of fear. The major wasn't finished. "There's another pattern we need to discuss," he said, pulling out a larger map. This one showed the entire Western Front, marked with dozens of red symbols indicating recent engagements. Over the past 3 weeks, 7 defensive positions designated as critical strongpoints have fallen to Canadian forces. He pointed to each location in turn. All 7 attacks were conducted at night. All 7 were launched during adverse weather conditions, heavy rain, snow, or limited visibility. All 7 involved the use of these improvised explosive devices. He let that hang in the air for a moment. "Gentlemen, this is not coincidence. This is not opportunistic behavior. This is systematic. The Canadians are deliberately choosing conditions that conventional military wisdom says make offensive operations impossible." Richter found himself nodding. That matched exactly what he had experienced. The major pulled out one final document. "This is from a tactical assessment circulated to German units in late November. Canadian forces have demonstrated repeated willingness to conduct offensive operations in adverse weather conditions, including heavy rain, snow, and limited visibility. Standard assumptions about operational tempo based on weather conditions should not be applied when facing Canadian units." He looked up from the document. "In other words, gentlemen, when you see bad weather approaching, do not assume you will have a quiet night. If Canadian forces are in your sector, assume the opposite. Richter felt something cold settle in his chest. For 5 years, he had relied on predictability, on understanding how the enemy thought and fought, on being able to anticipate their moves and counter them. Now he was being told that facing the Canadians meant throwing out those assumptions, meant preparing for the unexpected, meant accepting that the old rules no longer applied. The orders came down 3 weeks later. Richter's battalion was being redeployed to Hill 272. Richter looked at the map when the orders arrived and felt his chest tighten. He knew this hill. Every German officer in the sector knew it. It rose 80 meters above the surrounding farmland, a gentle slope covered in winter-dead grass and muddy tracks. It didn't look like much, but it dominated the terrain for kilometers in every direction. German engineers had spent weeks transforming it into a miniature fortress. Interconnected concrete bunkers, each one positioned to support the others with overlapping fields of fire. Pre-registered artillery positions that could drop shells on every approach route with mathematical precision. Wire obstacles strung in depth. Mines buried in patterns that would channel attackers into kill zones. It was, on paper, impregnable. British intelligence had studied the position extensively. Their recommendation was simple: bypass it entirely. American commanders had suggested waiting for heavy bombers, turn the hill into rubble from 30,000 feet, then send infantry to mop up whatever survived. Neither approach was chosen. The job went to the Canadians. Not because they were expendable. The Canadians weren't suicide troops thrown at impossible objectives. They were given these missions because they had a reputation for accomplishing difficult objectives. Richter understood the logic. He also understood what it meant for the men who had to defend against them. He arrived at Hill 272 with his depleted battalion on a grey afternoon when freezing rain was starting to fall. The bunkers were exactly as described. Solid concrete structures, their walls 2 feet thick, firing slits positioned to cover every approach. Richter walked the defensive line, inspecting each position. His men were exhausted. They had been fighting for months without adequate rest or replacements. The youngsters who had joined the unit fresh from training were either dead or no longer young. Private Dieter Vogel was still with him. The boy from Bavaria who had asked if the Canadians were drunk that first night. He was thinner now, his face drawn and pale, but he still had that spark of youthful optimism that Richter found both admirable and heartbreaking. "We'll hold, sir," Vogel said as they stood together in one of the bunkers, looking out over the approaches. "These positions are solid, better than anything we've had before." Richter said nothing. He was remembering other soldiers who had been confident in their defensive positions, other young men who had believed that concrete and steel would keep them safe. Most of them were dead now. The intelligence report arrived that evening. Reliable intelligence indicates Canadian forces rotating into this sector. Expected arrival within 48 to 72 hours. Richter called his officers together for a briefing. "Canadian forces are moving into our sector," he said, without preamble. "We should expect an attack within the next few days." Captain Werner Holt frowned. "Attack? Have you seen the weather forecast, Klaus? There's a major storm system moving in. This isn't conditions for offensive operations." "That," Richter said quietly, "is exactly when they will come." The other officers exchanged glances. Richter ordered double sentries, half the men on alert at all times, defensive artillery fires registered on all likely approaches. Some officers were skeptical, but he didn't elaborate. Some lessons had to be experienced. The weather deteriorated exactly as forecast. By the second night, the storm had arrived in full force. Freezing rain hammered down, turning everything into a landscape of ice and mud. It was the kind of weather that made simply staying alive a challenge. Richter's officers came to him that evening, their faces showing relief. "Sir, surely they cannot attack tonight. Not in this." "They will come tonight," Richter said. "Stand to, all positions, full alert." Midnight came and went. The storm continued unabated. At 0200 hours, the demonstration attack began. The right flank erupted in fire. Rifles and light machine guns opened up, creating a substantial volume of fire. Flares burst overhead. Machine guns chattered in response. Richter grabbed the radio. "All positions, report. Right flank under attack. Multiple contacts. Infantry assault." To anyone listening, it sounded like the main assault, but Richter had been waiting for this. "Left flank," he barked into the radio. "Left flank positions, report status. Left flank, no contact. Stay alert, they're coming." 20 minutes later, the first explosion tore through bunker number 3 on the left flank. The blast was massive, far larger than any single artillery shell. Reports flooded in. "Bunker 3 destroyed. Bunker 1 not responding. Enemy infantry advancing through left sector." It was happening exactly as he had feared. What Richter would later learn made the assault even more remarkable. Captain James McLeod, a high school teacher from Vancouver, had planned an unconventional assault. 3rd Platoon would demonstrate on the right, while 1st and 2nd Platoons assaulted from the left, using a flooded creek bed for concealment. The water was waist-deep, freezing cold, flowing fast enough to knock a man off his feet, and they would bring their cluster charges. Corporal David Jang had been selected to carry the first one. He was 28 years old, a combat engineer from Toronto. The weapon he assembled was a nightmare of improvised destruction. 5 German stick grenades, 2 British Mills bombs, 1 block of TNT, 1 satchel charge, all bound together with wire and electrical tape. Total weight, 40 pounds. 1 slip on the muddy slope and he would be vaporized. He strapped it to his back anyway. The infiltration began at midnight. Zhang and his section moved slowly through the darkness, descending into the creek bed. The water was so cold it drove the breath from his lungs. His legs went numb almost immediately. The cluster charge on his back weighed him down, unbalanced him. Several times he nearly fell. Each time his heart stopped. But he kept moving, because stopping meant failing. And failure meant his friends would have to take this position tomorrow. More of them would die. So he pushed forward through the freezing water. They reached the outer wire obstacles just as the demonstration attack began. Bangalore torpedoes blew gaps in the wire. The Canadians moved through. Still no German reaction on the left flank. Zhang kept moving up the slope. The mud was thick, clinging. Each step was an effort. The cluster charge seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. His back screamed. His legs trembled. But he could see the first bunker now. He could hear German voices inside. Then he stopped thinking and started moving. He rose to his feet and ran the last 20 meters in a stumbling sprint. Someone shouted in German. The machine gun started to traverse. Zhang dove. He slid through the mud and shoved the cluster charge against the bunker's entrance. His frozen fingers found the igniters, pulled them hard. Chemical fuses started burning. He scrambled backward. The explosion was apocalyptic. In his command bunker, Richter felt the ground shake. "All reserves, left flank, enemy breakthrough on left flank." But even as he gave the orders, more explosions rippled across the left side of the defensive line. Each blast was massive. Bunkers that had been considered impregnable were being reduced to craters. Richter grabbed his rifle and ran toward the left flank. A grenade landed 5 meters from him. He threw himself flat, waiting for the explosion. It didn't come. A dud. Pure luck. He scrambled to his feet and kept moving, trying to rally his men. But it was no use. The Canadians had punched through. As dawn began to break, Richter gave the order to withdraw. Hill 272 was lost. The casualties were devastating. 60% of his battalion, Private Dieter Vogel was among them. Richter found the boy's body in the ruins of bunker number 3. The explosion had killed him instantly. 19 years old. He had believed in the bunkers. Richter had known better, had heard the Canadians sing, had known they were coming, but he had sent Vogel to that position anyway, because orders were orders. Now Vogel was dead. Before the final withdrawal, Richter walked through the battlefield. Every German position had been methodically neutralized. Bunkers collapsed, weapons smashed, even the fighting positions destroyed with carefully placed explosives. It wasn't just victory, it was erasure. Then Richter saw something that made his blood run cold. In the ruins of one bunker, he found the remnants of a cluster charge. German stick grenades, British explosives, Canadian TNT. They had used German weapons against German positions, and they had carried these unstable devices up a muddy slope in freezing rain, through waist-deep water, knowing that one mistake would kill them. Richter tried to imagine German soldiers doing the same thing. Even in 1940, at the height of German military power, he couldn't imagine it. The Canadians had done it anyway. 3 weeks later, Richter's unit was pulled back to a reserve position, 3 kilometers behind the active front line. They established a battalion command post in a farmhouse. Supposedly secure, Richter couldn't sleep. He found himself outside at midnight, smoking, staring into the darkness. Then the door to the farmhouse exploded inward. A Canadian soldier stood in the doorway, face blackened, submachine gun already firing. Behind him were more shapes. The engagement lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Grenades through windows, controlled bursts, systematic destruction, then vanishing into the night. When it was over, Major Ernst Kessler, the battalion commander, was dead. 2 other officers dead, 2 wounded, radio equipment smashed, telephone lines cut, maps burning. Richter emerged from behind a woodpile, unhurt but shaking uncontrollably. They had been 3 kilometers behind the line, in a supposedly secure area. None of it had mattered. The report went up the chain of command quickly. Within 24 hours, Richter found himself in a meeting with General Hinrich Eberbach. Maps covered the table, marked with red symbols indicating Canadian positions. "Gentlemen," Eberbach said quietly, "we have a problem. The Canadians are not fighting the war we prepared for." He gestured to the maps. "The British take ground and hold it. The Americans take ground and establish supply lines. The Canadians take ground and then make absolutely certain that no one else can ever use it again. They don't just defeat you, they erase you from that position." One of his colonels started to speak. "Sir, they're taking heavy casualties." "The mathematics don't matter," Eberbach interrupted. "If they're willing to ignore them entirely, they achieve their objectives and then immediately prepare for the next one." He tapped the map. "Every position we've designated as critical, the Canadians have been assigned to break, and they do, every single time." New orders were drafted. German units facing Canadian sectors were to receive additional troops and heavy weapons, reserves positioned closer, defensive positions strengthened, bunkers reinforced. It was an implicit admission that normal defensive measures were insufficient, but resources were finite. Allocating extra strength to one sector meant weakening another. The Canadians were forcing Germany to overcommit resources just through their reputation. The fear itself had become a weapon. By April 1945, the Third Reich was dying. Everyone knew it. The fuel was gone, ammunition running out. The men were gone, veterans dead or captured. Their replacements were boys of 16 and 17, or old men from the Volkssturm, equipment breaking down, industrial base being destroyed. It was over. The war was lost, everyone knew it, but the fighting continued anyway. Lieutenant Klaus Richter stood in what passed for a command post and looked at the men he was expected to lead. They were children, thin faces, still soft with youth, eyes that hadn't yet learned to hide their fear. Mixed among them were grey-haired shopkeepers and farmers in their 50s and 60s. This was what remained of the force that had conquered most of Europe. Richter himself had aged beyond his 40 years. His hair was more grey than dark. Deep lines cut across his face. His hands had a permanent tremor. 5 years of war had hollowed him out from the inside. He looked at the map. His unit was assigned to hold a bridge. Not an important bridge, just one more obstacle to slow the Allied advance by a few hours. The bridge was defensible. Adequate ammunition, good fields of fire. By conventional standards, they could hold for at least 24 hours. Then the intelligence report arrived. Reliable intelligence indicates Canadian forces moving into this sector from the north. Richter stood very still, staring at the words. Tau. Then he walked outside and looked north, toward where the Canadians were coming from. Somewhere beyond his line of sight, they were coming, walking through whatever weather came, carrying their improvised weapons, singing their crude songs, and they would not stop. His officers gathered at his summons. "We're withdrawing," Richter said, without preamble. The silence was profound. "Sir, we have orders to hold this bridge," Lieutenant Franz Müller said. "We have adequate defensive positions. We're withdrawing," Richter repeated. Captain Werner Holt stepped forward. "Klaus, if we abandon this position without a fight, there will be consequences. Courts-martial, execution, possibly. There will be greater consequences if we stay." A young lieutenant protested. "Sir, the Canadian forces can't be that different." "You don't understand," Richter interrupted. "You haven't fought them. You don't know what they're capable of." Müller frowned. "They take casualties like any other force." "They do. Heavy casualties, rates that would cause British units to pull back, rates that would make American commanders request reinforcements." He paused. "And then they continue anyway." The officers exchanged uncertain glances. Richter continued. "We've been fighting for 6 months straight. We're exhausted. We're beaten. We know the war is over. We're just trying to survive until the surrender. But the Canadians? They fight like the war just started yesterday, like they have something to prove to the world." His hands clenched into fists. "We can't match that. We don't have the strength. We don't have the will. And I won't ask these boys to die proving a point that doesn't matter anymore." The silence stretched out. Finally, Müller spoke. "Sir, what about orders? What about duty?" Richter looked at him steadily. "My duty is to these men, not to a regime that's already dead, not to a war that's already lost, to them." He gestured toward the window, where young soldiers were visible. Private Dieter Vogel was 19 years old. He believed in our bunkers on Hill 272. He believed we could hold. His voice cracked slightly. I knew better. I had heard the Canadians sing. I knew they were coming. But I sent him to that position anyway because orders were orders. He died believing in a defense that was already doomed. He looked at each officer again. "I won't do that again, not to these children, not when it doesn't matter anymore." Holt's face had gone pale. "Klaus, if you give the order to withdraw, they'll execute you. Perhaps, or perhaps the war will end before they can arrange a court-martial. We withdraw in 1 hour. We move south and surrender to the first British or American unit we encounter." "Why not surrender to the Canadians?" one of the young officers asked. Richter looked at him for a long moment. "Because after 6 months of fighting them, I'd rather surrender to anyone else." 12 hours later, Richter's unit encountered a British patrol. They surrendered without firing a shot. The British soldiers were professional and correct. Richter felt nothing but relief. At least it wasn't the Canadians. At least his men would live. The interrogation took place in a tent behind the British lines. Captain Alistair Pembroke, a British intelligence officer, sat across from Richter with a file open. "Lieutenant Richter, you had a defensible position. Why did you withdraw without engaging the enemy?" Richter was quiet for a moment. "Because we received intelligence that Canadian forces were moving into our sector." Pembroke frowned. "That's it? You abandoned a defensive position simply because Canadians were approaching?" Yes, but you still had numerical parity, superior terrain. By any rational military calculation, Captain, have you ever fought against the Canadians? No. Then you don't understand what you're asking. Then explain it to me. Richter was silent, gathering his thoughts. 6 months. I fought against Canadian forces for 6 months. Hill 272. The storm raids, the deep penetration attacks. 6 months of watching them do things that conventional military doctrine says are impossible. He paused. We were exhausted, we were beaten. We knew the war was over, but the Canadians, they fought like the war had just started yesterday. I couldn't ask my men to match that. We would have died for nothing. Pembroke studied him carefully. Are you saying you were afraid of the Canadian forces? Richter met his eyes. Yes, I was afraid. Any sane man would be afraid of an enemy who attacks when attack is supposed to be impossible, who uses weapons they invented in the field, who appears from nowhere and disappears before you can respond. He leaned forward. But that's not why I withdrew. I withdrew because I learned something fighting them. You can fight superior equipment. You can fight superior numbers, but you cannot fight superior determination. And the Canadians had something we didn't. They were fighting to prove Canada was a nation. You can't outlast that kind of purpose, not when you're just trying to survive. Pembroke wrote something in his notes. One final question. Do you think Germany could have defeated the Canadian forces with more resources? Richter thought about that. No, because the problem wasn't our resources. The problem was our philosophy. We had manuals for everything. The Canadians had farmers who improvised explosives in muddy fields. They trusted their soldiers to think and adapt. Our standardization became our weakness. We couldn't adapt fast enough. Couldn't counter an enemy who invented new solutions to every obstacle. Pembroke closed his notebook. Thank you, Lieutenant. For what it's worth, I think you made the right decision. Richter nodded once and left. 40 years passed. Germany was rebuilt. The ruins were cleared. The dead were buried. The survivors grew old. Klaus Richter lived to see his country rise from the ashes. He never spoke much about the war. The memories were too painful, too complicated. But in 1986, a military historian named Dr. Wilhelm Strauss came to his apartment in Frankfurt with a request. He was conducting interviews with German veterans about their experiences facing different Allied forces. Richter, now 80 years old, agreed to be interviewed. They sat in his comfortable apartment, tea cooling on the table, while Strauss set up his recording equipment. You fought against the Canadians, Strauss said. Tell me about it. Richter was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. It started with singing. The first time I encountered them, it was December 1944, middle of a storm, weather that should have stopped all military operations. We heard singing. One of my soldiers, a boy from Bavaria named Dieter Vogel, asked me if they were drunk. A sad smile crossed his face. I knew they weren't. The Canadians sang before they attacked, he continued, describing that first night attack, the creeping barrage, the men walking through shell fire, the terrible weapons they carried. When Richter described Hill 272, his voice grew quieter. Young Vogel died there, 19 years old. He believed in our bunkers. He told me we would hold. He looked at Strauss. I knew better. I had heard them sing. I knew they were coming. But I sent him to that position anyway. He died believing in a defense that was already doomed. His voice cracked. That's what I couldn't make my superiors understand. It wasn't their weapons, it wasn't their tactics, it was their will. Strauss asked carefully, what made them different from the Americans or British? Richter thought about that. The Americans had everything. Fighting them was like fighting a factory, overwhelming but predictable. The British were tough, disciplined, stubborn, but also tired, 5 years of war had exhausted them. He paused. But the Canadians, they fought like they had nothing to lose and everything to prove simultaneously. They attacked when attack seemed impossible. They used weapons that shouldn't have worked, but did. They never slowed down. Not for weather, not for casualties, not for obstacles. He set down his teacup with a slight tremor. And they never stopped. They just kept coming. Were they better soldiers? Strauss asked. Better? Not necessarily, not in pure military skill. But they had something we didn't. Purpose. They weren't fighting because they were ordered to. They were fighting because they chose to, because they were proving Canada was a nation. His voice grew stronger. You can defeat soldiers who are forced to fight. But soldiers who choose to fight, who have a personal stake in victory, that's a different kind of enemy altogether. Strauss consulted his notes. The bridge position in April 1945, why did you withdraw? Richter smiled faintly. We were exhausted. The war was over. When I got the intelligence report that Canadians were coming, I realized I could order my men to hold. We could die delaying them by a few hours. It wouldn't change anything. Or I could save their lives. He turned back to Strauss. The Canadians had taught me that will matters more than doctrine, that determination can overcome superior positions. So I made a choice. I chose my men's lives over meaningless orders. Strauss asked about German soldiers preferring to surrender to British or American forces rather than Canadian. Richter was quiet. Fear. Not just the normal fear of battle, fear of something else. The Canadians made it personal. The way they fought felt vengeful sometimes, like they remembered what your unit had done to theirs. He held up a hand. I'm not saying they committed atrocities. Thousands of German soldiers were taken prisoner by Canadian forces and treated properly. But the perception existed, the fear existed, and fear affects morale. A tired, demoralized soldier makes mistakes. That psychological pressure was as effective as any weapon. Strauss closed his notebook. If you could go back and change how Germany fought against the Canadians, what would you do differently? Richter smiled sadly. Nothing, because by the time we understood what we were facing, the war was already lost. We were fighting to avoid losing. They were fighting to prove they existed. Purpose beats fear every time. He stood slowly, walking to a shelf where an old German helmet sat, dented and rusted. You want to know the real lesson the Canadians taught me? He picked up the helmet, showing Strauss a deep dent. This saved my life. Shrapnel from one of their cluster charges hit my helmet instead of my skull. Pure luck. He set it back down. I kept it, as a reminder that improvisation beat engineering. That determination beat doctrine, that will beat weapons. He turned back to Strauss. After the war, when I learned about what my country had done, the evil we committed, I understood something else the Canadians had taught me, that sometimes the right side wins, not because of superior weapons, but because they're fighting for something worth fighting for. His voice was very quiet. The Canadians were proving their nation existed. We were fighting for a regime that deserved to lose. So no, I wouldn't change anything. The outcome was just, and the lesson was necessary. The interview ended. As Strauss was leaving, Richter called out, Dr. Strauss, when you publish your research, will you include something for me? Of course. What would you like to say? Richter chose his words carefully. Tell them that the Canadians taught us that will matters more than doctrine. That determination can overcome any obstacle. That men who choose to fight are the most dangerous enemies of all. And tell them that sometimes the fear you feel facing such an enemy is just the recognition that they're fighting for something real, something worth dying for, something you've lost or never had. Strauss nodded slowly. I'll include that. Klaus Richter passed away in 1995 at the age of 91. In his will, he left his wartime papers to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. Included was a note: "To the Canadian soldiers I fought against, you taught me lessons I needed to learn. You showed me that will matters more than weapons. That determination can overcome any obstacle, that men fighting for something they believe in are unstoppable. I hope these papers help you remember what you accomplished, not just in defeating Germany, but in proving that Canada was a nation worth fighting for. You won because you deserved to win, and you never, ever stopped. With respect, Klaus Richter." The papers arrived at the museum in 1996. Among them were Richter's original after-action reports, his descriptions of Hill 272, his intelligence summaries, his personal journal. But the curator was most struck by a small, rusted piece of metal included in the package. A fragment of shrapnel, twisted and blackened, with a note attached. "From a Canadian cluster charge, Hill 272, January 1945, hit my helmet, saved my life. Kept it as a reminder that improvisation beat engineering, that determination beat doctrine, that will beat weapons. Thank you for teaching me what really matters in war and in peace." On quiet nights at the Canadian War Museum, that piece of shrapnel sits in a display case. Next to it is Richter's note, and next to that a photograph of Hill 272 as it looks today. Green grass covering old scars, peaceful farmland where men once fought and died. The exhibit is titled, "They Won't Stop, a German Officer's Perspective on Canadian Determination." Visitors read Richter's words, look at the rusted shrapnel, study the photographs, and they learn the lesson that Klaus Richter learned in the winter of 1944, that sometimes the strongest weapon isn't technology or numbers or tactical brilliance. Sometimes it's simply refusing to quit, refusing to slow down, refusing to accept any outcome except complete victory. The Canadians fought with that weapon, and they taught a German officer what it truly meant. The day German generals learned that Canadians would not slow down wasn't a single day. It was 1,000 days, 1,000 nights, 1,000 battles where conventional wisdom said stop, and the Canadians kept going. It was Hill 272 and 100 other hills. It was singing in the rain and walking through shellfire. It was carrying improvised weapons that could kill you as easily as the enemy. It was choosing to fight when you could have stayed home, choosing to continue when casualties mounted, choosing to attack when everyone else would have waited. It was proving through blood and sacrifice and unstoppable determination that Canada was a nation, and nothing was going to slow them down. Not until the job was done, not until victory was won, not ever. Klaus Richter understood that, finally, 40 years after the war ended. He understood that he had fought against something rare and precious, against men who had chosen to be there, against determination that couldn't be defeated, against the unbreakable will of soldiers who would not stop. And in understanding that, in accepting it and respecting it and trying to pass that lesson on to future generations, Klaus Richter achieved a kind of redemption, the old soldier's final tribute to the enemy who taught him what really matters: will over weapons, purpose over fear, and the unstoppable power of men who simply refuse to quit. They won't stop. 3 words that echoed through 40 years, 3 words that captured everything Klaus Richter learned fighting against the Canadians, 3 words that still resonate today in a peaceful museum where old enemies have become friends and old lessons are preserved for new generations. They won't stop, and they never did.